We are glad to have you with us again. Tonight, before you sleep, we will tell you the story of a king whose life was a whirlwind of battle and adventure. A man whose courage became so legendary he was known not by his name, but by his spirit. Tonight, we tell the story of Richard the Lionheart. So close your eyes and let us journey back through time, back more than 800 years, to an age of towering castles and epic quests. Let us go to the year of his birth, 1157. The world Richard was born into was a tapestry of sharp contrasts. It was an era of profound and unwavering Christian faith, where the Pope in Rome could command kings and the promise of eternal salvation guided the life of both peasant and prince. The great cathedrals reaching for the heavens were the centers of life, but their spiritual power was matched by immense worldly wealth and political influence. This was a society built on a rigid system we call feudalism, a great pyramid of loyalty. At the bottom were the serfs, tied to the land they worked, their lives dictated by the seasons and the will of their lord. Above them were knights and barons, who held that land in exchange for a vow of military service to a greater lord or the king. Loyalty was a sacred, sworn oath, the very glue of society. And yet, betrayal was the most common tool of politics, an ever-present shadow in the halls of power. It was also an age defined by the warrior. The armored knight on his warhorse was the ultimate weapon, a human tank trained for combat from boyhood. To control the inherent violence of this warrior class, a code of chivalry emerged, an ideal of honor, courage, and the protection of the weak. But this was often just an ideal. The reality of the 12th century was near constant, low-level warfare. Life was fragile, and death was a familiar guest. And at the absolute center of this volatile world sat the most powerful, brilliant, and dangerously dysfunctional family in all of Europe. They were the Plantagenets. Their domain was not a kingdom in the modern sense, but a personal empire stitched together by conquest, inheritance, and strategic marriage. Known as the Angevin Empire, it was a colossal collection of territories, including England, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and the vast, culturally rich Duchy of Aquitaine. It stretched from the misty borders of Scotland down to the Pyrenees Mountains bordering Spain. The Plantagenets were kings of England, but their native language was French, their hearts and ambitions firmly rooted in their continental lands. England, to them, was often just the wealthiest and most stable part of their sprawling collection of properties. The patriarch of this dynasty, and Richard's father, was King Henry II. Henry was a force of nature, a man of such boundless energy that his court was in a state of perpetual motion, always struggling to keep up. He was a restlessly brilliant ruler, a legal genius who inherited a chaotic, war-torn England and forged it into a kingdom of common law and royal justice with sheer force of will. But his genius was matched by a fearsome temper. In a fit of rage, he was known to throw himself to the ground, chewing on the straw and rushes that covered the stone floors. His outbursts were so extreme that courtiers would whisper that his family was descended from a demonic countess, and that from the devil they came, and to the devil they would one day return. This was the father, and the family, into which Richard the Lionheart was born. To match such a formidable king, a formidable queen was needed. And in Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine, Henry II found more than his match. If Henry was the storm, Eleanor was the whirlwind. She was not merely a king's wife, she was a ruler in her own right, a queen of two nations in her lifetime, and arguably the most remarkable woman of the entire Middle Ages. Eleanor was not born into the cold, damp climate of Northern Europe. She was a child of the South, the heiress to the vast, wealthy, and sun-drenched Duchy of Aquitaine. This was not some minor territory. Aquitaine was larger, richer, and far more culturally sophisticated than the entire Kingdom of France at the time. Its courts were the birthplace of the Troubadours, poet-musicians who created a culture entirely different from the grim, martial world of the North. They sang of chivalry and a new revolutionary idea called courtly love. This was a concept where a knight would devote himself to a noble lady, often one who was already married, performing great deeds in her name, not for physical reward, but for spiritual and emotional ennoblement. It placed women at the center of the artistic world in a way that was completely alien to most of Europe. From her grandfather, the very first of the troubadours, Eleanor inherited this passion for art, music, and literature, alongside a fierce intelligence and an iron will. At the tender age of 15, she was married to the heir to the French throne, who soon became King Louis VII. The pairing was a political masterstroke, but a personal disaster. Louis was a pious, gentle man, more suited to the quiet contemplation of a monastery than to the intrigues of a royal court or the realities of a marriage bed. Eleanor, vibrant, educated, and worldly, was bored to tears by the gloomy, austere atmosphere in Paris. She once famously remarked that she thought she had married a king, only to find she had married a monk. Her fiery spirit, however, could not be contained. When the Second Crusade was called to reclaim lost territory in the Holy Land, Eleanor did something unheard of for a medieval queen. She insisted on going herself. She did not go merely as a supportive wife. She went as the feudal leader of her own Aquitanian knights, vassals who were sworn to her, not to Louis. She rode at their head, and legend claimed she and her ladies-in-waiting dressed as Amazons, further cementing her reputation as a woman who broke all the rules. Her presence on the crusade was a constant source of scandal and logistical problems. Her baggage train said to be a city unto itself. In the Crusader city of Antioch, she had a spectacular public argument with Louis, siding with her charismatic uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, which fueled damaging rumors of an affair. The crusade itself was a catastrophic military failure, and the long, arduous journey only deepened the rift between the royal couple. More importantly, after more than a decade of marriage, she had given Louis only 2 daughters, but no son, no male heir to secure the French throne. The marriage was doomed. Upon their return to Europe, it was annulled, officially on the flimsy grounds of consanguinity, that they were too closely related to be married. But everyone knew the real reasons. Their personalities were fire and ice, and she had failed in her primary duty to produce a male heir. Now free, Eleanor was suddenly the single most eligible woman in Europe. The ruler of the vast and strategic Duchy of Aquitaine was a prize beyond imagination. Ambitious lords plotted to kidnap her on the road, to force her into marriage and seize her lands. But Eleanor had her own plans. In a move that shocked the world and redrew the map of Europe, she sent a message to the one man whose ambition and energy matched her own: the young Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy, and her ex-husband's greatest rival. Henry of Normandy did not hesitate. Just 8 weeks after Eleanor's marriage to the King of France was annulled, she married Henry in a small private ceremony. He was just 19 years old. She was 30. This was more than a marriage. It was a political earthquake. In a single stroke, Eleanor had not only spurned her pious ex-husband, but had also merged her vast southern domains with Henry's territories in the north. Overnight, the Angevin Empire was born. Their combined lands were a sprawling, formidable bloc that dwarfed the personal holdings of the French king, making Henry and Eleanor the undisputed power couple of Europe. The French king, Louis, was utterly humiliated, and a bitter rivalry was ignited that would last for generations. Their ambition did not stop there. 2 years later, in 1154, Henry resolved a long and bloody civil war in England known as the Anarchy, and crossed the Channel to claim the English throne as King Henry II. Eleanor, the former Queen of France, was now crowned Queen of England. Their power was absolute. The early years of their marriage were a whirlwind of passion and procreation, a seemingly perfect partnership. Together, they ruled their immense and diverse empire, traveling ceaselessly from castle to castle. And they were fruitful. Eleanor, who had failed to give her first husband a son, gave Henry a brood of them. First came Henry, known as the young king, then Richard, followed by Geoffrey, and finally the youngest, John. With 5 sons in total, the future of the Plantagenet dynasty seemed utterly secure. They were the most powerful and enviable family in the world. But the very passions that had brought them together would eventually tear their family apart. The partnership began to fracture under the weight of Henry's legendary infidelity. He had always had a wandering eye, but his affairs became more frequent and more flagrant, a deep and public humiliation for his proud, powerful wife. His most famous mistress was the fair Rosamund Clifford, for whom he allegedly built a secret retreat at the center of a maze. While the tales of Eleanor poisoning her rival are just legends, the insult was real and deeply felt. However, the true conflict was not over love, but over power. As their sons grew into ambitious young men, Eleanor expected Henry to grant them real authority over their assigned territories. She especially wanted to see her favorite son, Richard, take true command of her own beloved duchy, Aquitaine. But Henry, ever the autocrat, possessive and deeply suspicious, refused to relinquish a single shred of his control. He gave his sons titles and lands in name only, but kept all the actual power, revenue, and military authority for himself. He wanted them to be kings in waiting, but never kings in practice, so long as he drew breath. This policy turned the Plantagenet court into a viper's nest of intrigue and resentment. Eleanor, feeling marginalized, betrayed, and politically cast aside by the husband she had raised to greatness, began to change. Her loyalty shifted from her husband to her sons. She saw in their youthful ambition and their frustration a weapon she could wield against Henry. The once passionate love affair had transformed into a cold political chess match, played out across the vast expanse of their empire. And their own children, Henry, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, would be the pawns, and later the knights and bishops, in the devastating family war that was to come. As the rift between Henry and Eleanor grew into a chasm, she withdrew from his court and from England, establishing her own glittering court in the city of Poitiers, in the heart of her beloved Aquitaine. And she took with her the son who was most like her in spirit, the son who was her undisputed favorite, Richard. It was here, in the sun-drenched landscapes of southern France, far from the cold realities of his father's English administration, that the boy would become the man history remembers. To understand Richard, one must first understand Aquitaine. It was a land with its own language, Occitan, its own vibrant culture, and its own fiercely independent people. The barons of Aquitaine were notoriously proud, turbulent, and resistant to any authority but their own. For centuries, the duchy had been a virtually independent state, and its nobility viewed the rule of a northern king like Henry, an Angevin, as foreign domination. Their loyalty was to their duchess, Eleanor, and even that was conditional. Rebellion was their constant pastime. For a young prince, this was no peaceful inheritance. It was a political cauldron, a land that had to be constantly subdued and won over, not simply governed. This environment would become Richard's personal training ground. But it was his mother's court that shaped his mind. Eleanor's court at Poitiers was the undisputed cultural capital of Europe, while Henry's court was perpetually on the move, a mobile headquarters for a warrior administrator focused on law and logistics. Eleanor's was a semi-permanent haven of sophistication and intrigue. It was a magnet for the greatest artists, poets, scholars, and powerful noblewomen of the age. It effectively became a countercourt to Henry's, a center of political power loyal to her. Here, the ideals of courtly love, born in the poetry of her grandfather, were refined and practiced. She famously presided over courts of love, where nobles would gather to debate intricate romantic dilemmas as if they were legal cases. They would pose questions such as, "Can true love exist within marriage?" A pointed question, given her own marital situation. Or, which is the greater betrayal, that of a lover or that of a husband? These debates, while seemingly frivolous, sharpened the mind and taught a kind of emotional and rhetorical sophistication entirely absent from Henry's world. Eleanor personally oversaw every facet of Richard's education, molding him into her perfect southern prince, while his elder brother, Henry the young king, was raised in their father's sphere in the north. Groomed to be a conventional king obsessed with tournaments, Richard's upbringing was uniquely Aquitanian. He grew up speaking the southern tongue of Aquitaine as his primary language, alongside the northern French of the aristocracy. The English of his future subjects was a completely alien language to him, one he would never bother to learn. He was immersed in the culture of the Troubadours. He didn't merely listen to their songs of epic deeds and unrequited love. He became one of them. Under the tutelage of the finest poet-musicians, Richard learned to compose his own poems and set them to music. This was no princely affectation. He developed a genuine and considerable talent. 2 of his works survive to this day. One, written in a mix of French and Occitan, is a lament composed while he was held captive in Germany, a poignant and beautiful expression of abandonment by his men. This artistic sensitivity was a core part of his being. His education taught him the ideals of chivalry not as a mere military code, but as a complete way of life. He learned of pretz, the concept of personal worth, honor and reputation, and perich, the nobility of spirit and high birth. He was taught that a true nobleman must be as skilled with words as with a sword. He was being shaped, deliberately by Eleanor, into a ruler who would be loyal to her and to Aquitaine's unique culture. But the world of poetry and refined debate was only one half of his education. The other half would be taught not in the perfumed gardens of Poitiers, but out in the field, with blood, steel, and fire. While Richard was mastering the sophisticated arts of poetry and debate in Poitiers, his father, King Henry, saw a different purpose for his son's time in the south. The constant rebellions of the Aquitanian nobility were a thorn in Henry's side, a drain on his resources and attention. And so, he gave his teenage son a brutally practical education. Richard was tasked with taming his own duchy. From the age of 16, he was leading armies in the field, not in mock battles or tournaments like his brother Henry, but in real bloody campaigns against his own rebellious vassals. This was his true baptism by fire. The warfare in 12th century Aquitaine was not a matter of glorious, open battles between chivalrous knights. It was a relentless grind of siege and counter-siege. Power in the region was projected from stone castles, perched atop hills and cliffs. To rule Aquitaine, one had to be able to take these castles. This became Richard's specialty. He was forced to learn the grim, methodical art of siegecraft. He learned how to surround a fortress, cutting off its supplies. He became an expert in the use of siege engines, the medieval artillery, the mangonels and trebuchets that could hurl massive stones to batter down walls, and the siege towers that could deliver soldiers to the ramparts. He learned the deadly technique of mining, where engineers would dig tunnels beneath a castle's walls, propping them up with wooden beams, only to then set the beams on fire, causing the foundations to collapse. In these early campaigns, the key traits of his military genius began to emerge. The first was an astonishing, almost preternatural speed. Like his father, Richard understood that moving his army faster than his enemy could react was a weapon in itself. He would force march his men through the night, appearing before a rebel castle days before he was expected, winning the engagement before it had truly begun. The second trait was a terrifying decisiveness. Once he committed to a course of action, he was relentless. He did not dither or delay. This decisiveness was paired with a necessary, and at times shocking, ruthlessness. When he captured the supposedly impregnable castle of Tailbourg in 1179 after a siege of just 3 days, he made an example of it. He had its walls and towers systematically dismantled, torn down to the foundations, a stark warning to any other lord who might consider defying him. Mercy was a luxury, and in the brutal politics of Aquitaine, it was one he rarely afforded his enemies. Most importantly, Richard learned to lead from the front. He was not a general who commanded from a safe distance. He wore the same armor, slept in the same mud, and faced the same dangers as his men. His personal courage was breathtaking. He would be among the first on the scaling ladders, in the front ranks of a charge, his physical presence a galvanizing force for his soldiers. This inspired a fanatical loyalty in the men who served under him, but it also established a lifelong pattern of reckless endangerment. So the two sides of Richard's character were forged simultaneously, in the same land. In Poitiers, he was the refined troubadour prince, the patron of the arts. But just a few miles away in the field, he was a hardened, pragmatic, and brutal commander. He was solidifying his dual nature: the poet and the warrior, the lion and the nightingale. In 1172, his mother and father formally invested him as the Duke of Aquitaine in a grand ceremony. He was given the ducal ring, the banner, and the sword. But this ceremony was a facade. While Henry was happy for Richard to do the hard, bloody work of pacifying the duchy, he kept all true power, and more importantly all the revenue from the territory, for himself. Richard had the title and the responsibility, but none of the authority or the wealth of a true ruler. This deep, festering resentment at being a duke in name only would soon lead him to join his brothers in the ultimate act of treason: open war against their own father. Richard's simmering resentment was not unique. By the year 1173, the magnificent Plantagenet Empire, which seemed to be the most stable power in Europe, had become a powder keg of familial jealousy, waiting only for a spark. That spark came not from some grand political dispute, but from a seemingly minor decision King Henry made regarding his youngest and favorite son, John. John, alone among his brothers, had been granted no lands, earning him the humiliating nickname John Lackland. To remedy this, Henry arranged a marriage for the boy and, as part of the deal, decided to gift him 3 strategic castles: Chinon, Loudun, and Mirbeau. The decision, made without consultation, was a profound insult to his other sons. The castles were located in lands nominally assigned to Geoffrey, but they were under the direct oversight of the eldest son and heir, Henry, the young king. For the young king, this was the ultimate humiliation. For years, he had worn a crown but possessed no kingdom. His father had insisted on having him crowned King of England in 1170 to secure the succession, a French custom that resulted in 2 living kings in the same realm. The young king was handsome, charismatic, a champion of the tournament circuit, and immensely popular with the nobility. He looked and acted the part of a king, but his title was a hollow cage. He had no lands to rule, no revenues to spend, no real power to wield. He had to go to his father, the old king, like a child asking for an allowance. To see his father now casually carving up his inheritance to provide for the youngest brother was an intolerable offense to his status and his pride. Filled with a righteous fury, the young king did the unthinkable. He fled his father's court and sought refuge with the one man who would delight in the chaos: King Louis VII of France. Louis, Eleanor's pious ex-husband, had spent years watching with bitter envy as the Plantagenet Empire grew to monstrous size. He saw a golden opportunity to shatter his rival's power from within. He welcomed the young rebel with open arms, formally recognized him as the sole legitimate king of England, and pledged his full military support. The rebellion of the young king was the signal the other brothers were waiting for. From Aquitaine, 16-year-old Richard, and from Brittany, the cunning Geoffrey, soon joined him in Paris. Their own frustrations with their father's autocratic control boiled over. They too swore allegiance to the King of France in exchange for his help in seizing their promised lands. But while the sons were the public face of this great betrayal, the true mastermind was their own mother. From her court in Poitiers, Eleanor of Aquitaine had been carefully stoking the fires of her son's ambition and resentment. For her, this was the culmination of years of political marginalization and personal humiliation at Henry's hands. She saw her sons as the instrument of her revenge. She was the strategist in the shadows, encouraging them, coordinating their plans, and using her immense wealth and influence in Aquitaine to raise support for their cause. In a final, daring act, she even attempted to join her sons in Paris, disguising herself in men's clothing to make the perilous journey. But Henry's spies were everywhere. She was intercepted, captured, and taken back to her husband as a prisoner. Her gamble had failed, and it would cost her 15 years of liberty. Her capture, however, did not stop the war she had helped unleash. The Great Revolt of 1173 was not a minor baronial uprising. It was a war on an imperial scale. King Henry II, now in his 40s, was suddenly faced with an existential threat to everything he had built. His enemies formed a massive coalition. 3 of his own sons, backed by the King of France, were preparing to invade his continental heartland of Normandy. To the north, the King of Scotland saw his chance for plunder and crossed the border into England. And within both England and Normandy, many of the most powerful barons, chafing under Henry's firm rule and lured by the promises of his sons, raised their banners in rebellion. The empire was ablaze, attacked simultaneously from the outside and rotting from within. It seemed that the old lion was surrounded, betrayed by his own cubs, and on the very brink of being torn to pieces. Betrayed by his wife and all 3 of his elder sons, attacked on every front, King Henry II seemed on the verge of total collapse. A lesser ruler would have crumbled. But it was in this moment of supreme crisis that Henry proved why he was one of the most formidable rulers of his age. The old lion was wounded, but his roar had lost none of its terror. With a characteristic, almost manic burst of energy, he moved to save his empire with breathtaking speed. First, he secured Normandy, his continental heartland, repelling the French invasion with a corps of loyal troops and highly paid mercenaries. Then, in a daring gamble, he crossed the English Channel with his army, landing in England to confront the rebellion there. His first act on English soil was a masterstroke of political theater. He journeyed to Canterbury Cathedral and performed a dramatic public penance at the tomb of Thomas Becket, the archbishop whose murder years earlier had been indirectly caused by Henry's own angry words. Barefoot and dressed in sackcloth, the king allowed himself to be scourged by the monks. This act of humility won him immense popular support, casting him as a penitent sinner seeking God's forgiveness. And seemingly, God answered. In what was seen as a divine miracle, on the very next day, his loyal forces in the north won a decisive battle and captured the invading King of Scotland. With England now pacified, Henry moved like a whirlwind back to the continent to deal with his sons. The rebellion, which had begun with such confidence, completely fell apart before the old king's furious onslaught. One by one, the rebel fronts collapsed. Richard, despite fighting bravely in Aquitaine, found himself isolated and without allies. He was the last of the brothers to surrender. In a carefully staged scene, he rode to his father's camp, dismounted, and knelt at his feet, begging for forgiveness. Henry was surprisingly lenient with his sons. He forgave them and allowed them to retain their titles and lands. He understood they were more valuable as figureheads than as martyrs. But for his wife, Eleanor, there would be no such mercy. He viewed her as the primary instigator, the serpent in his own garden. She was placed under house arrest and would remain a prisoner, moved from castle to castle for the next 15 years. The war was over. Henry had won an astonishing victory against impossible odds. His empire was intact, but his family was shattered beyond repair. The peace that followed was merely a truce. The sons had tasted rebellion, and the father had learned to trust no one. The following years were a dreary cycle of shifting alliances and skirmishes between the brothers. Henry, in a cynical policy of divide and rule, often pitted them against one another, believing that if they were busy fighting each other, they would not conspire against him. Richard and his older brother, Henry the young king, were soon at war over control of Aquitaine. Then, in 1183, tragedy struck. While on campaign, once again in rebellion against his father, Henry the young king fell ill with dysentery, the scourge of medieval armies. Dying in agony, he was overcome with remorse for his life of rebellion. He sent a message to his father, begging to see him one last time, but Henry's advisors, fearing a trap, convinced the old king not to go. The young king died clutching a stone as an act of penance, and King Henry was heartbroken by the death of his handsome, popular, though perpetually troublesome heir. His death, however, dramatically altered the political landscape. Suddenly, Richard was the heir to England, Normandy, and Anjou, the core of the empire. King Henry immediately devised a new plan. He demanded that Richard give up his beloved Aquitaine to his youngest brother John. For Richard, this was unthinkable. Aquitaine was his mother's inheritance, the land where he had been raised, the source of his identity. He refused absolutely. The central conflict now shifted to Richard versus his father and his favorite brother John. 3 years later, in 1186, another brother, the cunning Geoffrey of Brittany, was killed, trampled to death in a Parisian tournament. Of the 4 rebellious sons, only 2 now remained, Richard the warrior and John the schemer. In the final years of his life, King Henry's affection for his youngest son, John, grew into a dangerous obsession. Courtiers whispered that the old king, in his dotage, was plotting to disinherit Richard entirely and hand the crown of England to John. For Richard, this was the ultimate threat, a betrayal he could not allow. Seeing his inheritance in jeopardy, he made a new, formidable alliance. He turned to the new King of France, Philip II, a man who was once his childhood friend and tournament companion. But the young Philip was a cold, calculating politician, far more dangerous than his father Louis. He saw the Plantagenet family conflict as the perfect tool to weaken his overmighty English rivals. In the summer of 1189, Richard and Philip launched a devastating, lightning-fast offensive against Henry's lands in France. The old king, now sick, exhausted by decades of ceaseless rule, and emotionally weary, was no longer the man he once was. He was completely outmaneuvered by his own son, whose military genius had been honed for years in Aquitaine. Defeated, humiliated, and pursued across his own lands, Henry was forced to agree to a humiliating peace treaty dictated by Richard and the French king. Lying on his sickbed in his castle at Chinon, Henry made one final request: to see the list of the barons who had joined his son's latest conspiracy. His clerks brought him the parchment. With fading eyes, he read the names of those who had betrayed him. And at the very top of the list, he saw the name of his adored, his most beloved son, John. The final betrayal from the one son he thought had remained loyal completely broke him. He turned his face to the wall. "Shame," he was heard to whisper. "Shame on a conquered king." He cursed his rebellious sons, Richard and John, and died a few days later. Upon hearing the news, Richard was now, finally, King of England. Upon learning of his father's death, Richard rode to Fontevraud Abbey, where the old king's body lay awaiting burial. The chroniclers of the time, ever eager to find divine meaning in events, recorded a chilling moment. As Richard approached the funeral bier, they wrote, blood began to flow from the nostrils of King Henry's corpse. In the medieval mind, this was a clear and terrifying sign. The body was bleeding in the presence of its killer. Richard, seeing this, was said to have knelt before his father's body and wept, a moment of silent, private remorse amidst his ultimate triumph. But if he felt any guilt, it did not linger. He was now, at the age of 31, the ruler of the vast Angevin Empire. He was Duke of Normandy, Duke of Aquitaine, Count of Anjou, and King of England. But from the very instant he possessed these titles, Richard had only one all-consuming obsession. It was an idea that dwarfed every other responsibility of kingship. That idea was the Crusade. Years earlier he had taken the cross, making a solemn, sacred vow to journey to the Holy Land to win back Jerusalem from the great Sultan Saladin. At the time, it was a declaration of piety. Now, as king, it was a practical mission. The crowns and titles were not the end goal. They were merely the means to an end. Governing England, reforming laws, administering justice, these were trivial distractions. His true destiny, he believed, lay in the East. He viewed his new kingdom of England not as a home to be nurtured, but as a treasure chest to be unlocked. It was the most well-organized, efficiently taxed, and wealthiest of all his domains, a legacy of his father's genius for administration. And Richard intended to liquidate its assets with an efficiency that was both breathtaking and utterly ruthless. His sole purpose was to amass the largest and best-equipped crusading army Europe had ever seen, and he would let nothing stand in his way. His first act was to continue and enforce the collection of a revolutionary tax known as the Saladin tithe. This was a levy on an unprecedented scale, demanding 10% of all revenues and all movable property, furniture, tools, livestock, cash, from every single person in the realm who was not taking the cross themselves. It was a crushing burden on the populace, deeply unpopular, but ruthlessly effective. This, however, was only the beginning. Richard effectively put his entire kingdom up for auction. Everything was for sale. His father, Henry II, had spent his reign trying to centralize power and professionalize the government, appointing competent men to positions of authority. Richard reversed this policy in a matter of months. The most important and powerful offices in the kingdom were sold to the highest bidder. If you had enough money, you could buy the position of sheriff for a county, giving you immense local power. Wealthy churchmen could purchase bishoprics. He sold royal castles, royal manors, and vast tracts of royal forest. He sold charters to towns, granting them a measure of self-government in exchange for enormous sums of cash. It was a fire sale of the English government and its assets. He showed a complete lack of sentimentality or long-term vision for the kingdom. When one of his father's most loyal and competent administrators, Ranulph de Glanville, the Justiciar of England, offered to resign, Richard eagerly accepted, then had the old man arrested and only released him after he paid a colossal fine of £15,000, an astronomical sum at the time. He replaced this experienced administrator with men who had paid handsomely for their jobs. His overriding principle was simple. Every person and every position had a price, and that price was to be paid into his war chest. The long-term stability and governance of the kingdom were a secondary concern, if they were a concern at all. England, the land of his birth but not of his heart, was being systematically mortgaged for the sake of a holy war to be fought thousands of miles away. Richard's fundraising reached its zenith with an act that would have horrified his father. Years earlier, Henry II had achieved a major strategic victory by defeating and capturing William the Lion, the King of Scotland. He forced the Scottish king to sign the Treaty of Falaise, a humiliating document that made the entire Kingdom of Scotland a vassal state to England. English soldiers occupied key Scottish castles, and the King of Scotland formally acknowledged the King of England as his feudal overlord. It was a crowning achievement of Henry's reign. Richard, in his single-minded pursuit of cash, dismantled this achievement without a second thought. For the sum of 10,000 silver marks, Richard sold Scotland its freedom back. He formally cancelled the Treaty of Falaise, renounced all claims of overlordship, and withdrew the English garrisons from the Scottish castles. To him, this was a simple transaction. A distant and troublesome vassal state was less valuable than a massive immediate infusion of cash for his crusade. The long-term strategic implications for the English crown were irrelevant to him. He was trading a future of political dominance for the immediate needs of his war. His final piece of business in England was to deal with his notoriously treacherous brother John. Richard was no fool. He knew that leaving John unsupervised near the seat of power was an invitation to conspiracy. His solution was a calculated risk, a mix of bribery and exile. First, he showered John with an immense portfolio of lands and titles across England, making him the Count of Mortain and granting him control of 6 counties, with all their revenues. Overnight, John became the wealthiest and most powerful nobleman in the realm. The goal was to make him too rich and comfortable to bother with rebellion. Then, Richard made both John and his illegitimate half-brother Geoffrey swear a solemn oath that they would not set foot in England for the next 3 years. He hoped this would keep them physically separated from the levers of power while he was away on crusade. It was a clever plan, but one that badly underestimated John's insatiable ambition. Having completed these arrangements, Richard surveyed the results of his whirlwind 6 months of fundraising. He had accumulated a colossal treasure, an army of thousands of elite knights and soldiers, and a vast fleet of ships to carry them to the Holy Land. In his wake, he left a kingdom drained of cash, its government staffed by the highest bidders, and its strategic position in Britain weakened. But none of that mattered to him. His goal was achieved. A contemporary chronicler captured his cynical attitude perfectly, recording a joke the king made at the time. Looking at all he had sold, Richard quipped, "I would have sold London if I could find a buyer." This famous line, whether a literal quote or not, perfectly encapsulates his mindset. The King of England had treated his kingdom like a property to be liquidated. Now, with his coffers overflowing, the King Crusader was ready. He had no intention of staying to govern the land he had just so thoroughly plundered. His eyes were fixed on the east, on the promise of glory, battle, and the liberation of Jerusalem. In December of 1189, Richard the Lionheart left England. He would not set foot in his kingdom again for more than 4 years. With his kingdom's treasury emptied into his own, Richard crossed the Channel to the continent. His first task was to rendezvous with his partner and chief rival in the crusading enterprise, King Philip II of France. Together, their 2 armies represented the greatest military force assembled in Europe in a generation. The plan was for the 2 kings to march their armies south together, a clear demonstration of Christian unity, before setting sail for the Holy Land. The logistical challenge was immense. Thousands of knights, tens of thousands of infantry and support staff, a mountain of supplies, and a vast herd of war horses all had to be moved and fed across the length of France. After a long and arduous journey, the massive crusading host reached its destination for the winter, the bustling, wealthy port of Messina on the island of Sicily. The plan was to wait out the dangerous winter sailing season and make the final crossing to the Holy Land in the spring. Sicily at the time was one of the richest kingdoms in the world, a vibrant melting pot of Norman, Greek, and Arab cultures. But it was also a kingdom in the grip of a political crisis. The previous king, William II, had been married to Richard's own sister Joan. When King William died without an heir, the throne was usurped by a powerful nobleman, his cousin Tancred of Lecce. Tancred, fearing Joan's influence as the popular dowager queen and a Plantagenet princess, had placed her under arrest in a palace in Palermo. More importantly, at least to Richard, Tancred had seized Joan's immense dowry and was refusing to pay the vast legacy that King William had promised to Richard's father, Henry II, to fund the crusade. Richard did not arrive in Messina as a humble pilgrim merely seeking passage. He arrived as a king with a list of non-negotiable demands. He sent envoys to Tancred, who was in the capital, Palermo, demanding 3 things. First, the immediate and unconditional release of his sister Joan. Second, the full and immediate payment of her entire dowry, every last gold coin. And third, the fulfillment of King William's promises of supplies and ships for the crusading effort. Tancred, the new and insecure king of Sicily, made a grave error in judgment. He underestimated Richard. He believed he could delay and prevaricate. He released Joan from her confinement, and she was escorted with great ceremony to Richard's camp, but he withheld the money, hoping to negotiate a smaller payment and assuming the English king was too focused on the crusade to cause trouble. He failed to comprehend the character of the man he was dealing with. Richard the Lionheart was not a man who tolerated being denied what he considered his rightful property. His patience, never a strong virtue, began to wear thin. The situation was made worse by the growing tension within the city of Messina itself. The sudden arrival of tens of thousands of English and French soldiers had completely overwhelmed the port. The locals, a proud and cosmopolitan mix of Greeks and Sicilians, viewed the northern Crusaders as arrogant, drunken, and violent barbarians. The Crusaders, in turn, looked down on the locals with contempt. Fights broke out in taverns, merchants gouged the soldiers with exorbitant prices, and soldiers took what they wanted without paying. The city became a powder keg of mutual resentment. The more diplomatic French king, Philip, tried to keep his men in check, but he was completely overshadowed by Richard's immense wealth, charisma, and the sheer size of his army. Richard made no such efforts at diplomacy. He strode through the city as if he owned it, his banners flying, further inflaming the locals' anger. The winter had barely begun, and already the great crusading alliance was fraying, and the city of Messina was on the brink of a violent explosion. The simmering resentment in Messina finally boiled over into open violence. A dispute at the city gates between a few English soldiers and the local guards over a loaf of bread, or perhaps the price of wine, escalated with terrifying speed. Insults were traded, then blows. Soon, the great bells of Messina's churches began to ring, the ancient signal for a call to arms. The citizens, enraged by weeks of perceived insults from the foreign soldiers, poured into the streets. They closed the city's massive gates, rushed to the walls, and began to rain down stones and arrows on any crusaders caught outside. It was a full-blown revolt. King Philip of France, ever the politician, attempted to negotiate. He met with the city's leaders, trying to de-escalate the situation. Richard the Lionheart, however, was not in a negotiating mood. His men were being attacked. His authority, and more importantly, his honor, had been directly challenged. For him, there was only one possible response: overwhelming and decisive force. As Philip was talking, Richard was acting. He called his commanders, and in a display of the military efficiency he had perfected in Aquitaine, he prepared his army for a full-scale assault. What followed was a terrifying demonstration of his genius for siege warfare. His knights and men-at-arms formed up, their shields locked. His famed archers prepared to provide covering fire. He gave the order, and the English army charged the city. The resistance of the citizen militia, however brave, was no match for a professional army led by the most feared commander of the age. Richard's soldiers stormed the gates, while others threw scaling ladders against the walls. Richard himself, as always, was in the thick of the fighting, a terrifying figure of royal fury. The battle was over in a matter of hours. The city of Messina, which had defied him, was now his by right of conquest. His men poured through the streets, plundering and setting fires. And above the main gate, Richard ordered his personal standard, the 3 golden lions of the Plantagenets, to be raised in triumph. This act was a grave insult to his ally. When King Philip saw Richard's banner flying alone over the conquered city, he was enraged. In the rigid feudal hierarchy, Philip, as King of France, was technically Richard's overlord for his French territories. He felt that as the senior monarch, his banner should be flying, or at the very least, they should fly side by side. He saw Richard's action for what it was: a public declaration that the King of England was the dominant senior partner in the Crusade. It was a clear message that Richard had the most money, the best army, and the will to act while others talked. The argument that followed was bitter and personal, creating a crack in their alliance that would never truly heal. News of the swift and brutal fall of Messina traveled fast to the capital at Palermo. King Tancred, who had believed he could outmaneuver Richard with diplomacy and delays, was horrified. He now understood that he was dealing with a man for whom violence was a natural extension of policy. He capitulated immediately and completely. He agreed to pay the full sum of Joan's dowry and the legacy owed to Henry II, a massive payment of 40,000 ounces of gold. With the money secured, Richard's mood changed. Having proven his point, he could now afford to be magnanimous. He signed a formal treaty with Tancred, recognizing him as the legitimate king of Sicily. In a further diplomatic move, he officially betrothed his designated heir, his young nephew Arthur of Brittany, to one of Tancred's infant daughters, thereby forging a formal alliance. Before he left, Richard constructed a formidable wooden siege castle on a hill overlooking Messina, a final, intimidating reminder of his power. He gave it the provocative name Mategriffin, which meant, "Curb the Greeks." As spring arrived, Richard prepared to leave Sicily. He had spent the winter not merely waiting, but actively enriching his war chest and demonstrating his absolute power to allies and enemies alike. He had his sister, a vast fortune in gold, and a fearsome reputation. But his relationship with the King of France was now poisoned by jealousy and resentment. The Great Crusade was already showing signs of disunity before it had even reached the Holy Land. In the spring of 1191, Richard the Lionheart finally set sail from Sicily. His magnificent fleet was a sight to behold, a veritable floating city of over 150 ships, carrying thousands of soldiers, his priceless war horses, and the vast treasure he had amassed. But the calm Mediterranean waters were deceptive. A few days into the voyage, the fleet was struck by a ferocious spring storm. The sky turned black, and the sea rose in fury. The ships, battered by gale-force winds and mountainous waves, were scattered across the sea. Several of Richard's ships were driven off course and wrecked upon the southern coast of the island of Cyprus. The island was ruled by a renegade Byzantine prince named Isaac Komnenos, a cruel and arrogant tyrant who had seized control of Cyprus and declared himself its independent emperor. The shipwrecked Crusaders might have expected help from a fellow Christian ruler. They received the opposite. Isaac saw the disaster not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity for plunder. He immediately seized all the survivors as prisoners and confiscated the valuable cargo and treasure that had washed ashore. Even more disastrously, one of the ships that had managed to find shelter in the harbor of Limassol, though damaged, carried the two most important women in Richard's life: his sister Joan, the recently freed Queen of Sicily, and his fiancée, Berengaria of Navarre, whom he had just rendezvoused with. Isaac refused to allow the two royal ladies to come ashore for fresh water or supplies, effectively holding them hostage in his port, while their wrecked escort ships lay on his beaches. A few days later, Richard's own flagship, having weathered the storm, arrived at Cyprus in search of his missing vessels. What he found ignited a cold fury in him. His men were imprisoned, his treasure was stolen, and his own sister and future wife were being held captive. He immediately sent envoys to Isaac, demanding, in no uncertain terms, the immediate release of all Crusader prisoners and the full restitution of every piece of stolen property. Isaac Komnenos made the fatal mistake of hubris. Safe behind the stone walls of Limassol, surrounded by his own army, he looked upon Richard's small squadron of ships and saw no great threat. He had heard of the King of England's reputation but did not truly comprehend it. He believed he was dealing with just another Crusader lord he could intimidate and extort. In response to Richard's demands, Isaac sent back a message of arrogant and insulting defiance. He refused to release the prisoners and refused to return the treasure. He had committed the same error as Tancred of Sicily, but unlike Tancred, he would not be given a second chance to correct it. For Richard the Lionheart, this was not just a political dispute over prisoners and gold. It was a profound personal insult to his honor, and an unforgivable threat to his family. His response would be swift, total, and devastating. Richard's response to Isaac's defiance was immediate and overwhelming. He had been insulted and his family threatened. For the Lionheart, there was no room for diplomacy. There was only retribution. He gathered the knights and men-at-arms from the ships he had with him and launched a full-scale amphibious assault on the city of Limassol. This was a notoriously difficult and dangerous military operation, but Richard led it with the confidence of a master. His archers, standing on the decks of the ships, unleashed a hail of arrows to cover the landing, while the knights boarded smaller landing craft. Richard, impatient as ever, was said to have leaped from his own boat into the waist-deep water, wading ashore as one of the first to land. The waiting Cypriot army, composed mostly of ill-disciplined local militia, was shocked by the ferocity and speed of the attack. They had expected to defend against a small raiding party, not a full-scale invasion led by a warrior king. Richard and his heavily armored knights crashed into their lines on the beach, and the defenders broke and fled in terror. Isaac Comnenus himself, watching the disaster unfold, panicked and abandoned his capital, fleeing into the island's interior. Limassol fell to Richard almost immediately. He entered the city in triumph, securing the port and, most importantly, freeing his sister Joan and his fiancée Berengaria. As he consolidated his control, his fortunes improved even further. The rest of his great fleet, scattered by the storm, began to arrive at the now safe harbor of Limassol, bringing the full might of his army to bear. With them came other important crusading lords, including Guy of Lusignan, the deposed king of Jerusalem, who came to seek Richard's aid in his political struggle for the throne of the Crusader kingdom. Richard's position was now unassailable. In the midst of this military campaign, Richard paused to attend to a personal matter. On the 12th of May, 1191, in the chapel of St. George in Limassol, Richard the Lionheart married Berengaria of Navarre. It was a magnificent ceremony, a brief flash of royal splendor in the middle of a war. A few days later, Berengaria was formally crowned Queen of England. It was a unique moment in history. The only time an English king had ever married, and an English queen had ever been crowned, so far from their own domains. His wedding festivities did not distract him from his primary goal, the complete subjugation of Cyprus and the punishment of Isaac. Leaving his new wife and his sister safe in Limassol, Richard launched a lightning campaign to conquer the entire island. He divided his forces, sending one contingent by land while he led another by sea, systematically capturing every port and castle. Isaac's attempts to rally his forces were futile. Richard's disciplined, battle-hardened crusaders swept aside any resistance. The Cypriot army was crushed, and Isaac was driven into the last of his strongholds. Finally, seeing that all was lost, the self-proclaimed emperor surrendered. According to a famous and revealing legend, Isaac's one condition for his surrender was that Richard promise not to put him in irons. Richard, with a grim and cynical sense of humor, readily agreed to the promise. He then ordered the former emperor to be bound in chains forged not of iron, but of pure silver. He had kept the letter of his promise, while brutally mocking its spirit. The conquest of Cyprus was a complete and total success. What had begun as an unplanned diversion caused by a storm had turned into a massive strategic victory. The island was fertile, wealthy, and most importantly, perfectly located. It became the great unsinkable supply depot for the Third Crusade. From its safe ports, a constant stream of ships could carry food, water, fresh horses, and reinforcements to the Christian armies fighting on the mainland, just a short voyage away. Richard had accidentally secured the logistical key to the entire campaign's survival. With a new kingdom under his control, his reputation for invincibility soaring, and his army rested and resupplied, Richard the Lionheart was finally ready to sail for his true destination, the war for the Holy Land. In early June of 1191, having left Cyprus as its new master, Richard the Lionheart's fleet finally appeared off the coast of the Holy Land. The sight that greeted him was one of utter desperation. For almost 2 long, brutal years, The combined Christian armies of the Third Crusade had been locked in a bloody and futile siege of the great port city of Acre. The situation was a nightmarish stalemate, a diabolically complex war of attrition. It was famously a siege within a siege. The Christian army had surrounded the formidable walls of Acre, trying to starve out its determined Muslim garrison. But in turn, the Christian camp itself was surrounded by the great field army of the Sultan Saladin, who was camped in the hills overlooking the plains. Saladin's forces constantly harassed the Crusaders, attacking their supply lines and attempting to break through their lines to relieve the city. The Christian camp was a trap, a narrow coastal strip of death and misery. Conditions inside the camp were apocalyptic. Disease was rampant. Scurvy, dysentery, and typhoid fever, which the chroniclers called camp fever, swept through the packed ranks, killing thousands upon thousands. The dead included the highest nobles, bishops, and even Sibylla, the Queen of Jerusalem. Food was scarce, morale had hit rock bottom, and the leadership was fractured by petty rivalries. The whole enterprise was teetering on the edge of complete collapse. Richard's rival, King Philip of France, had arrived several weeks earlier, and while his presence had provided a minor boost, he had failed to break the deadlock. Philip was a cautious, methodical commander, and he was dismayed by the chaos and lack of discipline in the Crusader camp. He had begun digging trenches and employing his own siege engines, but no significant progress had been made. The exhausted Christian army remained paralyzed by sickness, fatigue, and a lack of decisive, unified leadership. The arrival of Richard's fleet was like a bolt of lightning from a clear sky. For the weary, half-starved soldiers in the trenches, the sight of his dozens of red-sailed ships appearing over the horizon was nothing short of a miracle. His ships were laden not just with thousands of fresh, healthy soldiers, but with something the Crusade needed even more: immense sums of money. And he brought with him the huge, state-of-the-art siege engines he had ordered built in Sicily. But more than any material resource, Richard brought himself. He brought an unstoppable energy, an iron-willed determination, and a singular focused military genius that instantly revitalized the entire crusading effort. Ignoring the cautious advice of other leaders and dismissing the endless political squabbles, he threw himself into the work with a fury. His first action was to use his vast personal wealth to solve the morale crisis. He announced he would pay any soldier in the camp, regardless of their loyalty, a handsome wage of 3 gold pieces a month. The effect was immediate. Thousands of soldiers who had not been paid in months flocked to his banner, including many of the best knights from the French army. This act of generosity was also a calculated power play, one that deeply annoyed King Philip, who could not hope to match his rival's wealth and was now watching his own authority be eroded. Richard personally toured the front lines, reorganizing the placement of catapults and planning new points of attack. To incentivize the common soldiers, he offered a bounty of gold for any man who could pull a stone from the walls of Acre under enemy fire. He brought his own massive siege engines into the fray, great wooden trebuchets that had been given fearsome nicknames like Bad Neighbor and God's Own Catapult. Soon, the bombardment of Acre's walls became a relentless 24-hour-a-day assault, a thunderous noise that shook the very foundations of the city. The entire tempo of the siege had changed overnight. The Lionheart had arrived, and the exhausted stalemate was about to be broken. The Lionheart's arrival had transformed the siege, but his mortal body was not immune to the plagues of the Crusader camp. Shortly after launching his grand assault, Richard, like thousands before him, was struck down by the dreaded camp sickness known as Arnaldia, a severe illness, likely a form of scurvy, marked by high fever, hair loss, and debilitating weakness. For days, the great warrior king was confined to his silk bed, unable to stand, let alone lead a charge. Any other leader would have been incapacitated, and the momentum of the siege would have been lost. But Richard's will was a force of nature that illness could not conquer. From his sickbed, he continued to command the assault with an iron grip. in a display of determination that became legendary. He ordered his men to carry him on a magnificent litter to the front lines. Propped up on cushions, shivering with fever, he would personally supervise the aiming of his great catapults, shouting orders to his engineers. In one famous moment, he saw a Muslim soldier on the battlements who was taunting the Crusaders. Richard calmly called for his personal crossbow, a powerful and sophisticated weapon. An attendant loaded it and handed it to the sick king, who raised it with a trembling arm, took aim from his stretcher, and sent a bolt flying that struck the man down. The message was clear. Whether healthy or sick, the Lionheart was always in the fight. This relentless pressure, directed by a seemingly unbreakable will, took its toll. Day and night, the great stones from his trebuchets smashed against Acre's walls. His sappers dug tunnels beneath the city's main towers, causing one of them, the so-called Accursed Tower, to collapse. The Muslim garrison, exhausted after 2 years of constant warfare and seeing that Saladin's army was unable to break through to rescue them, finally reached their breaking point. On the 12th of July, 1191, the city of Acre surrendered to the Crusader kings. It was a monumental victory, the first great success of the Third Crusade. But the moment of shared Christian triumph almost immediately degenerated into a bitter feud, thanks to Richard's arrogance. After the city fell, the leaders of the crusade began hoisting their personal banners over the captured battlements. Richard, as a king, raised his standard. Philip, as a king, raised his. Then, Duke Leopold V of Austria, who commanded what was left of the German contingent of the crusade, also raised his ducal banner. To Richard, this was an intolerable act of presumption. In the rigid feudal hierarchy, a duke was not the equal of a king. He saw Leopold's banner flying beside his own as a personal insult. In a fit of high-handed rage, he ordered his men to tear down the Austrian banner and throw it into the filth of the city's moat. It was a profound and public humiliation, an unforgivable offense to Leopold's honor in front of the entire crusading army. The Austrian duke was incandescent with rage. He swore he would have his revenge on the arrogant English king. He soon packed his bags and left the crusade, returning to Europe nursing a mortal hatred for Richard. In his moment of triumph, Richard had made an enemy who would one day hold his fate in his hands. The squabbling did not end there. A few weeks later, King Philip of France also announced that he was abandoning the crusade and returning home. He claimed he was in poor health and had urgent political matters to attend to in France. Richard was furious. He publicly accused Philip of being a coward and a deserter, of breaking his sacred crusading vow. He suspected correctly that Philip's real intention was to return to Europe to plot against Richard's lands while the English king was still occupied in the Holy Land. Richard forced Philip to swear a solemn oath not to attack his territories, an oath Philip had no intention of keeping. With the departure of both Leopold and Philip, Richard the Lionheart was now the sole, supreme, and undisputed commander of the Third Crusade. This was likely the position he had craved all along. But he had achieved it at a terrible price. The great Christian alliance was in tatters, and he was now surrounded by the resentful soldiers of the French army and had earned the undying enmity of a powerful European duke. At the pinnacle of his victory at Acre, Richard had sown the seeds of his future downfall. With Acre secured and his rivals departed, Richard the Lionheart was the master of the crusade. His primary objective now was to march his army south along the coast to capture the vital port of Jaffa, the gateway for a final assault on Jerusalem. But there was one major problem. Inside Acre, he was now responsible for the thousands of Muslim soldiers from the city's former garrison, who were now his prisoners of war. The terms of Acre's surrender had been precise. Saladin had agreed to pay a massive ransom of 200,000 gold dinars, release over 1,000 Christian prisoners, and most symbolically, return the relic of the true cross, which he had captured years earlier at the disastrous Battle of Aquitaine. In return, Richard would spare the lives of the garrison. For a month following the city's fall, a tense negotiation played out between the two camps. Messengers went back and forth, but progress stalled. Saladin struggled to gather the enormous sum of gold required and to locate the specific Christian nobles demanded for the exchange. To Richard, this was all a pretense. His patience, never his strong suit, was wearing paper thin. He became convinced that Saladin was deliberately delaying, stalling for time to allow his own army to regroup while Richard's was bogged down in Acre. The thousands of prisoners were a massive logistical burden. They had to be guarded by his own soldiers, men he needed for the march south. They had to be fed from the army's precious supplies. From Richard's purely military and brutally pragmatic perspective, the prisoners had ceased to be a bargaining chip and had become a dangerous liability. He issued an ultimatum to Saladin: deliver the full payment and the prisoners by the deadline, or the deal was off. The deadline came and went. Saladin, having delivered a first installment, asked for more time. Richard granted none. His decision was made. It was a judgment of shocking brutality, a cold and calculated act of military expediency. On the 20th of August, 1191, Richard ordered the Muslim prisoners to be brought out of the city. Nearly 3,000 men, along with some of their wives and children who had been with them in the garrison, were marched under heavy guard to a set of small hills called Iadi, in full, horrifying view of the helpless Saladin and his entire army. On Richard's signal, his Crusader soldiers fell upon the bound and defenseless prisoners. The massacre was methodical and total. At the end of it, the ground was littered with the bodies of the slain. It was an act of terror that sent a shockwave across the Holy Land. It stood in stark, damning contrast to the clemency and mercy Saladin himself had shown when he captured the Christian-held city of Jerusalem just a few years earlier. Richard's justification was simple and legalistic. Saladin had broken the terms of the surrender, and therefore the lives of the prisoners were forfeit. Militarily, it had achieved his goal. His army was now unburdened, free to march. And it sent a terrifying message to every other Muslim-held fortress in Palestine. The Lionheart's promises of safety were conditional, and his wrath was absolute. But the massacre forever stained his reputation, revealing the hard, ruthless core of the man beneath the chivalric veneer. With his hands now bloodied, Richard the Lionheart finally turned his army south and began the long march toward glory. With the grim business at Acre concluded, Richard the Lionheart turned his army south. On the 22nd of August, 1191, the great Crusader host, numbering some 20,000 men, marched out of the city. Their objective was the port of Jaffa, more than 100 kilometers down the coast, the capture of which was essential for any future assault on Jerusalem. What followed was not a simple journey, but a grueling 2-week-long ordeal that would become a masterclass in military discipline and logistics, and would culminate in one of the most decisive battles of the age. Richard knew that the march along the hostile coast, with Saladin's main army shadowing his every move, was fraught with peril. He organized his army into a tight, formidable marching column, designed for maximum defense. The formation was a work of genius. On the army's right flank was the deep blue of the Mediterranean Sea, an impassable barrier to the enemy. Sailing in parallel just offshore was Richard's entire fleet. This was a brilliant strategic decision. The fleet protected his right flank completely, carried the army's heavy baggage, and provided a constant source of fresh supplies, especially water. It also served as a floating hospital, allowing him to evacuate the sick and wounded, ensuring that only his fittest soldiers remained in the marching column. The army's left flank, facing inland, was the side of maximum danger. From the hills and forests to the east, Saladin's forces would emerge. Richard therefore turned his column into a moving fortress. The exposed left flank was guarded by a long line of his best infantry, their shields interlocked, their spears bristling outwards, forming a wall of steel. Behind them marched the crossbowmen, protected by the infantry, ready to lay down a deadly field of fire. Tucked safely inside this protective shell was the heart and soul of his army. The 12 squadrons of heavily armored knights, his ultimate weapon, kept fresh and shielded from the worst of the enemy's attacks until the moment of decision. The entire column moved at a deliberately slow, grinding pace, never allowing gaps to open in its ranks. Saladin, a masterful strategist in his own right, understood that a full frontal assault against this disciplined, moving fortress would be suicidal for his lighter cavalry. Instead, he opted for a brutal strategy of relentless harassment. His goal was to bleed the Crusaders, to wear down their morale, and above all, to provoke the proud, aggressive European knights into a foolish, premature charge that would break their precious formation. Day after day, under the blazing Levantine sun, Saladin unleashed his forces. His agile Turkish and Bedouin horse archers would sweep in from the plains, firing volley after volley of arrows into the dense Christian ranks before wheeling away, always staying just out of reach of the heavy Crusader cavalry. His light infantry, armed with javelins and bows, would launch sudden, screaming attacks on the rear of the column, hoping to cause panic and confusion. For the Crusaders, the march was a living hell. The heat was suffocating, trapped inside their thick gambesons and heavy chainmail. They were tormented by thirst and by the constant swarms of insects. And endlessly, there was the sound of arrows, a constant deadly hum, the thud of bolts hitting shields, and the screams of men and horses struck down. The psychological strain was immense. For the European knights, bred for the glorious, decisive charge, this was torture. To be forced to plod along, enduring a constant barrage of missiles without being allowed to retaliate, was an almost unbearable provocation. But Richard understood Saladin's strategy perfectly. He had issued one single, inviolable order. No one, under any circumstances, was to break ranks and charge the enemy until he, and he alone, gave the signal for a general coordinated assault by the entire cavalry force. He rode tirelessly up and down the length of the column, his presence everywhere, enforcing this iron discipline with his sheer force of will. The greatest strain fell on the rear guard, which bore the brunt of Saladin's attacks. This position of honor was held by the proud and famously aggressive Knights Hospitaller. For 2 weeks they endured the worst of the harassment, their tempers fraying, their patience worn down to a thread. Saladin, seeing their distress, began to concentrate his attacks on them, hoping they would be the first to break. As the Crusader army approached a plain of dry woodland north of the city of Arsuf, the pressure became intolerable. The stage was set for a decisive confrontation. As Richard's army emerged from the forest of Arsuf onto the open plain that stretched before the city, Saladin knew his moment had come. He had decided that his strategy of harassment had run its course. The Christian army was weary, heat-stricken, and on edge. Now was the time to risk everything in a single decisive engagement to annihilate the Crusader host before it could reach the safety of Jaffa. He gave the order to commit his entire army to a full-scale assault. The attack began with a terrifying crescendo of sound. The air filled with the deafening beat of Saracen war drums, the blare of trumpets, and the war cries of tens of thousands of men. Saladin's elite Mamluk heavy cavalry, his Turkish infantry, and Sudanese archers surged forward in disciplined waves. A black cloud of arrows, so thick it seemed to obscure the sun, descended upon the Christian column. The harassment of the previous weeks now seemed like child's play. This was a storm of steel and death. The primary focus of the assault was, as before, the rear guard. The Knights Hospitaller, already at the edge of their endurance, were now engulfed in a desperate, ferocious battle for survival. Their ranks were savaged by the arrow storm. Their precious war horses, the key to their power, were falling in droves. The Hospitaller commander, Garnier de Nablus, sent a desperate messenger to Richard, begging him for the signal to charge. Richard, calm amidst the chaos, refused. It was not yet the perfect moment. He wanted to draw Saladin's forces in even closer, to let them commit fully to the attack and disorganize their own ranks in the process. He sent back a simple message: "Hold the line." A few minutes later, another frantic message came. Still, Richard refused. He would wait for the enemy to expose themselves completely. But in the rearguard, the line was about to break. The pressure became more than human discipline could bear. The Marshal of the Hospitallers and another prominent knight, Baldwin de Caron, seeing their men being cut to pieces and their formation about to collapse, finally snapped. Screaming for St. George, they lowered their lances and, in a direct, flagrant act of disobedience, spurred their horses out of the formation and charged headlong into the enemy. The rest of the Hospitaller squadron, seeing their leaders go, surged forward with them. For any other commander, this would have been a disaster. An unplanned, piecemeal charge was exactly what Saladin had been hoping for. It should have been the moment his forces surrounded and annihilated the isolated knights. But Richard the Lionheart was not any other commander. His genius lay not just in meticulous planning, but in his unparalleled ability to react and command in the heat of a crisis. He did not panic. He did not curse his disobedient knights. He recognized the moment for what it was. The charge had begun, and it could not be stopped. So he would lead it. Instantly, Richard turned the chaos of the moment into his masterstroke. "The signal," he roared. He ordered the royal trumpets to sound the call for the general charge, the very signal he had been waiting to give. Along the entire length of the column, the knights of the 12 squadrons, who had been simmering with agonizing patience for 2 weeks, heard the blast of the horns. The wait was over. They lowered their lances, spurred their fresh, powerful war horses, and the entire cavalry force of the Crusader army crashed forward like a tidal wave. Richard himself, his great sword in hand, led the charge from the center, a golden lion on his helmet, plunging deep into the enemy ranks. The impact was cataclysmic. Saladin's army, which had been swarming the Christian column, disorganized and focused on the attack, was utterly unprepared for such a sudden, massive, and unified counterassault from a foe they thought was on the brink of collapse. The lines of Saracen infantry were trampled and shattered. The light cavalry, so effective at harassment, were no match for the irresistible momentum of thousands of heavily armored knights. The Crusaders carved a bloody path through Saladin's army, which broke and fled in a panic. The victory was absolute. Richard, ever the disciplined commander even in the heat of triumph, quickly reined in his knights, preventing them from pursuing the fleeing enemy too far and risking an ambush. He reformed his army and, after a brief rest, continued the march. The Battle of Arsuf was a staggering strategic and psychological victory. It shattered the myth of Saladin's invincibility in open battle and confirmed Richard's reputation as the greatest warrior in Christendom. His path to Jaffa was now clear. The Lionheart had faced the Sultan's full might and had emerged completely victorious. The victory at Arsuf was more than just a military achievement. It set the stage for one of history's most fascinating and legendary rivalries. The Third Crusade was not merely a war between Christianity and Islam, or a clash of faceless armies. It was a deeply personal duel between two of the most formidable and charismatic figures of the entire Middle Ages. On one side was Richard the Lionheart, the archetypal Western warrior king. On the other was a Nasir Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West simply as Saladin, the Sultan who had united the Muslim world. Though they would never meet face to face, they waged their war like a grand, deadly chess match, developing a profound and complex sense of mutual respect that has become the stuff of legend. To understand this dynamic, one must first understand Saladin. He was not the cruel, one-dimensional villain of Crusader propaganda. He was a leader of immense sophistication, piety, and political skill. Of Kurdish descent, Saladin rose from a distinguished but not royal family to become the Sultan of both Egypt and Syria, achieving what had seemed impossible. uniting the often warring Muslim factions under the single banner of holy war against the Crusader states. His crowning achievement, and the very act that triggered the Third Crusade, was his reconquest of Jerusalem in 1187 after the disastrous Christian defeat at the Battle of Hattin. But it was the way in which he took Jerusalem that defined his character and his reputation. When the first Crusaders had conquered the city nearly a century earlier, they had perpetrated a horrific, indiscriminate massacre of its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, wading, as one chronicler wrote, through streets ankle-deep in blood. When Saladin retook the city, he demonstrated an extraordinary clemency. He strictly forbade any massacres or pillaging. He allowed the Christian inhabitants to ransom their own freedom for a modest sum, and he famously used his own treasury to pay the ransom for thousands of the city's poor who could not afford it, allowing them to leave with their possessions unharmed. He was known throughout his own world for his generosity, his strict sense of justice, and his unwavering devotion to his faith. This was the man Richard now faced, not a barbarian, but an adversary whose character was as immense as his own. And Saladin, in turn, recognized in Richard, whom the Arab chroniclers called Malik Rik or Malik Linkater, the King of England, a commander of a skill and ferocity he had never before encountered. Their war became a bitter and bloody conflict, yet it was punctuated by gestures of a chivalry so remarkable they seem almost unbelievable. The chronicles of both sides are filled with anecdotes that illustrate this respect. After the Battle of Arsuf and the capture of Jaffa, Richard once again fell gravely ill with a fever, incapacitated in his tent. When Saladin heard that his great rival was sick, he did not see it as a military opportunity. Instead, he saw it as an offense against the proper order of things. A great warrior should not be laid low by a common illness. He sent Richard gifts to aid in his recovery: precious fresh fruits, pears and peaches. And most valuable of all in the searing desert heat, he sent containers of pure snow, hauled down from the distant mountains, so that the English king might cool his drinks and soothe his fever. He even offered the services of his own personal physicians, who were rightly considered the most advanced medical practitioners in the world at the time. Another famous incident occurred during a later, desperate battle outside Jaffa. Richard, leading a charge, had his horse killed from under him. The most feared warrior in Christendom now found himself fighting on foot, like a common soldier, a position of extreme danger and immense indignity for a king. Saladin, observing the battle from a nearby hill, reportedly declared through a translator that it was an abomination for a king of such valor to be fighting on foot. He then dispatched a groom, who led 2 magnificent Arabian war horses across the active field of battle and presented them to Richard as a gift from the Sultan, so that his enemy could continue to fight in a manner befitting his royal rank. It was a gesture of profound respect for the warrior, even as he remained a mortal enemy. These remarkable gestures of personal chivalry were not just isolated incidents. They were part of a broader, ongoing dialogue between the two leaders. Even as their armies skirmished and prepared for battle, Richard and Saladin were in almost constant communication through their envoys. Their war was a strange mix of brutal combat and sophisticated diplomacy. The chief negotiator for the Muslim side was often Saladin's own brother, Al-Adil, a man known to the Crusaders as Saladin. Al-Adil was a highly skilled diplomat and a formidable general in his own right, and he developed a warm and genuinely friendly relationship with King Richard. The Christian and Muslim chronicles both record instances of Richard and Al-Adil feasting together, exchanging lavish gifts, and speaking with frank admiration for one another, even while planning the next day's military maneuvers. This continuous communication led to one of the most astonishing diplomatic proposals in the entire history of the Crusades. As the military campaign seemed to be heading for a long, grinding stalemate, Richard, ever the creative and unconventional thinker, put forth a peace plan of breathtaking audacity. It was a solution so far outside the conventional thinking of the 12th century that it must have left both sides momentarily stunned. Richard proposed that his own sister Joan, the widowed Queen of Sicily, should marry Saladin's brother, Aladil. This was just the beginning. As a married couple, this Christian princess and Muslim prince would be invested as the joint rulers, the king and queen, of Jerusalem and all of Palestine. Jerusalem itself would become a condominium, a shared city, open and accessible to peaceful, unarmed pilgrims of both faiths. The Christian holy sites, such as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, would be returned to the stewardship of the Christian priests, while the Muslim holy sites, like the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, would remain under Muslim control. The coastal cities already in Crusader hands, such as Acre and Jaffa, would remain part of the Crusader kingdom. In essence, Richard was proposing a political dynastic solution to a holy war. He was suggesting they end the conflict not with a final bloody battle, but by joining their two families and sharing the prize. It was a plan of pure political pragmatism, one that completely ignored the religious fervor and zealotry that fueled the entire crusading movement. Saladin, himself a pragmatist, was intrigued. The chronicles suggest he gave the proposal serious consideration. His brother Aladil was reportedly very enthusiastic about the idea of marrying the sister of the great Malik Rik and becoming the king of Jerusalem. But the plan was simply too radical for its time. It was doomed to fail. On the Christian side, the high-ranking clergy and the masters of the military orders were utterly horrified. The idea of marrying a Christian princess, the sister of the King of England, to a Muslim infidel was, in their eyes, a shocking blasphemy. They saw it as a betrayal of the very purpose of the crusade. And when Richard finally presented the idea to his sister, Joan herself flatly refused, declaring she would never marry a Muslim, even to become a queen. On the Muslim side, the reaction among the religious hardliners was equally negative. The idea of handing over any measure of control of the holy city of Jerusalem, which they called Al-Quds, to the Christians was unthinkable. The grand, revolutionary peace plan collapsed under the weight of the religious dogmas it had tried to circumvent. It remains a fascinating what-if of history, a testament to the fact that the two great leaders of the Third Crusade were perhaps more pragmatic and broad-minded than the fanatical movements they led. With diplomacy having failed, only one option remained. The war had to continue. Richard the Lionheart gathered his army at Jaffa and prepared to march inland, towards the city that was the cause of it all, the ultimate prize, Jerusalem. With the collapse of the grand marriage proposal, the path of diplomacy was closed. Richard the Lionheart, his army rested and resupplied at the newly captured port of Jaffa, now turned his eyes to the ultimate prize. In the autumn of 1191, he began the arduous march inland, up through the rocky hills of Judea, towards Jerusalem. The morale of the common soldiers was sky-high. They had witnessed their king's invincibility at Arsuf. They believed that the final glorious battle to liberate the holy city was at hand. But the march soon turned into a miserable, grinding ordeal. Saladin, having been defeated in open battle, reverted to the strategy he knew best, attrition and scorched earth. He would not give Richard the decisive battle he craved. Instead, he sought to let the land itself defeat the Crusader army. As the Christians advanced, Saladin's forces systematically destroyed everything in their path. They stripped the orchards of their fruit, burned the fields, and most critically, they poisoned or filled in every well along the route. The Crusader army could not live off the land. Every single ration of food and every skin of water had to be hauled on long, vulnerable supply convoys from their coastal base at Jaffa. Then, the weather turned against them. The season changed, and the notoriously harsh winter rains of the Levant began. The dry, dusty tracks turned into a quagmire of thick, clinging mud. Wagons carrying vital supplies became hopelessly bogged down. Men and horses struggled through the cold and wet, their mail rusting, their spirits sinking with every difficult step. And all the while, Saladin's Turkish horse archers reappeared, ghosting out of the mist and rain to launch hit-and-run attacks on the struggling column, picking off stragglers and raiding the vital supply lines. The triumphant march had become a slow, freezing, muddy slog. Despite these hardships, by January 1192, the army had reached a town called Beitnuba, just 12 miles from Jerusalem. From the hilltops, the Crusaders could see it, the distant towers and walls of the Holy City. After years of struggle and thousands of miles of travel, their sacred goal was finally in sight. A wave of euphoria swept through the ranks. They believed their suffering was over. But Richard, the strategist, knew their position was perilous. He called a council of war, gathering his most senior commanders, the French nobles, the local lords of the Crusader states, and most importantly, the masters of the military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. These were men who had spent their entire lives fighting in this land, and they presented their king with a cold dose of brutal reality. They advised him, in the strongest possible terms, not to attack. They argued that even if they could somehow storm the city's walls, a formidable task, as Saladin had spent months refortifying them and stocking them with a large elite garrison, they would be walking straight into a death trap. Their reasoning was simple and inescapable. The moment Jerusalem was captured, the vast majority of the European knights and soldiers would consider their crusading vow fulfilled. They would pack their bags and immediately set sail for home, leaving a skeleton force to defend a massive city with breached walls. This small garrison would be deep inland, completely cut off from the coast and any hope of resupply from the fleet. Saladin's main army, which remained intact, would immediately close in and besiege the city. The Christian conquerors would become the besieged, and they would be inevitably starved into submission or annihilated. To take Jerusalem now, they argued, would be to win a glorious victory for a week, only to suffer a catastrophic and final defeat a few months later, losing not only the city but the entire Crusader army with it. For Richard, it was an agonizing decision. His every instinct as a warrior, his personal honor, and the fervent hopes of his entire army screamed for him to attack. But as a commander, he could not ignore the cold, impeccable logic of his veterans. To press on would be an act of reckless vanity, not sound strategy. With a heart that was said to be heavier than it had ever been, he made the most difficult decision of his military career. He gave the order to turn back. The effect on the army's morale was devastating. The common soldiers, who could not understand the grim strategic calculations, felt utterly betrayed. They had been so close. Chroniclers tell of men weeping with frustration. One famous story recounts how a knight trying to cheer his king pointed to the skyline and said, "My lord, come here and I will show you Jerusalem." Richard, in response, covered his face with his shield, declaring that he was not worthy to look upon the holy city, since he was unable to deliver it. The demoralized army began the long, miserable retreat back to the coast. The retreat from Beitnuba was a bitter pill for the Crusader army to swallow. Morale was at an all-time low, and the once great host was plagued by desertions and dissent. Richard, knowing he needed to give his men a new purpose to prevent the army from dissolving completely, marched them south to the ruins of the city of Ascalon. Saladin had systematically demolished its fortifications to deny the Crusaders a strategic base between Jaffa and Egypt. Richard announced that their new task was to rebuild it. He turned his entire army into a massive construction crew. He tried to lead by example, carrying stones and working on the walls himself, urging his high-ranking nobles to do the same. This, however, created new frictions. Many of the proud European aristocrats, including the French Duke of Burgundy and Richard's new nemesis, Leopold of Austria, were deeply offended by the idea of performing manual labor like common masons. The arguments that followed further poisoned the relationships within the Crusader leadership. The rebuilding of Ascalon was a strategically sound move, but it was a period of grim, frustrating work under a cloud of failure. It was during this time that a ship arrived from England, bearing the most alarming news possible. The messages were for Richard, and they confirmed his worst fears. His brother, Prince John, had broken his sacred oath. He had returned to England and was openly plotting to usurp the throne. He was spreading rumors throughout the kingdom that Richard was dead, or that he had been abandoned by his army and would never return. John was seizing royal castles, installing his own men, and attempting to force the barons of England to swear allegiance to him. Even more dangerously, the dispatches confirmed that John was in a treasonous alliance with King Philip of France. Philip, free from the oath he had sworn to Richard, was preparing a full-scale invasion of Richard's vital continental territory, Normandy. The entire Angevin Empire, the inheritance Richard had fought his father to secure, was in grave peril. He was facing the loss of everything. Richard was now caught in an impossible dilemma. On one hand, he was bound by his sacred vow as a crusader, a vow that would not be complete until Jerusalem was freed. His personal honor and his place in Christendom depended on it. On the other hand, he was a king, and his primary duty was to protect his own kingdom from invasion and rebellion. He convened a council of his commanders and, with a heavy heart, announced his decision. He must abandon the crusade and sail for home immediately to save his crown. The news ripped through the Crusader camp. The French contingent, who had long resented Richard's leadership, were openly pleased and prepared to leave as well. But for the knights and soldiers who had followed Richard, and for the local Christian barons whose very survival depended on the Crusade's success, it was a moment of utter despair. They felt abandoned on the brink of their ultimate goal. In a last desperate effort, a delegation representing the entire army came before the king. They implored him not to leave. They begged him, in the name of God, to stay and lead them just one more time against Jerusalem, pledging that every man would follow him to the death. The chroniclers record this as a moment of profound emotional turmoil for Richard. He had a clear and pressing duty to return home, but the passionate loyalty and desperate pleas of his men moved him deeply. He withdrew to his tent to wrestle with his conscience. To stay was to risk his throne. To leave was to abandon his vow and the men who had sacrificed everything to follow him. In the end, his honor as a crusader won out over his pragmatism as a king. He emerged from his tent and made a dramatic announcement. He would stay. He would not leave the Holy Land until he had made one last, final attempt to reach the Holy City. The decision was met with a delirious explosion of joy. Morale, which had been in the gutter, soared to new heights. The Lionheart had chosen them. The king had chosen his vow. With renewed hope and determination, the Crusader army turned its back on the sea and began to march inland once more. The Lionheart's decision to stay sent a shockwave of renewed hope through the Crusader army. The transformation was immediate. The despair and dissent that had plagued the camp vanished, replaced by a surge of loyalty and determination. For the second time, the army turned its back on the coast and began the arduous march inland towards Jerusalem. This time, the advance was faster, more confident. The summer weather was hot, but the rains had passed. Richard, his energy fully restored, led with vigor, recapturing several small but strategic forts that had been retaken by Saladin's forces. Once again, they reached the town of Beit Nuba. They stood on the same ground where they had tasted bitter disappointment just a few months earlier. But this time felt different. The soldiers were filled with a desperate final hope that their king would not be denied. From the hilltops, they could once again see the walls and towers of the holy city, shimmering in the summer heat. The prize was just 12 miles away. The entire army was a coiled spring, ready for the final glorious assault. But the strategic realities that had forced the first retreat had not disappeared. In fact, they had grown worse. Saladin had used the intervening months wisely. He had poured even more troops into Jerusalem's garrison and had worked tirelessly to strengthen its walls and defenses. More critically, as the summer heat intensified, the issue of water became paramount. Saladin had launched a systematic campaign to destroy the entire water supply chain around the city. Every well for miles around had been poisoned with filth, every cistern smashed, every spring filled with sand. An army laying siege to Jerusalem would have no local source of water and would quickly die of thirst under the blistering sun. Richard knew he was at a critical juncture. His heart urged him forward, but his mind, honed by years of command, saw the immense peril. This time, to avoid the blame for another retreat falling solely on his shoulders, he employed a clever political tactic. He formed a special committee, a jury of 20 men, composed of 5 Knights Templar, 5 Knights Hospitaller, 5 French barons, and 5 of the local Christian nobles from the Kingdom of Jerusalem. These were the most experienced and respected men in his army. He gave them a single solemn task: to advise him on the best course of action. Should they risk everything on a direct assault on Jerusalem, or should they adopt the long-standing alternative strategy of striking at Saladin's true power base by invading Egypt? The committee deliberated, weighing the passion of their goal against the grim military facts. Their conclusion was unanimous, and it was heartbreaking. They advised that a direct assault on Jerusalem was simply too great a gamble. Even if they succeeded, the problems of holding the city remained. But now, with the lack of water, a prolonged siege was impossible. They would be the ones to break, not the defenders. They therefore formally recommended that the army should abandon the Jerusalem campaign and turn its forces towards Egypt. For Richard, this was the end of the line. An invasion of Egypt would be a massive, years-long undertaking. But the urgent news from England of his brother's treason and King Philip's aggression meant he no longer had years. He barely had months. The committee's recommendation had given him the political cover he needed to make the decision he already knew was inevitable. The dream was over. He accepted the council's verdict. The crusade would not march on Jerusalem. The final order to retreat was given. This time, the disappointment in the army was mixed with a somber sense of finality. They had been given a second chance, and they had failed again. The common soldiers were utterly crushed. It is said that Richard himself rode to the crest of a nearby hill, from which the holy city was clearly visible. A captain next to him, wanting to share the moment, said, "My lord, come and see the holy city." But Richard, overcome with the grief of his failure, raised his shield to cover his eyes, declaring that his eyes should not look upon a city which his arms could not conquer. The dream of a lifetime, the entire purpose of the Great Crusade, had died on a dusty hilltop just 12 miles from its goal. The dream of capturing Jerusalem was dead. A somber mood settled over the Crusader army as it retreated to the coast. The Great Crusade was effectively over. Richard the Lionheart, his health failing and his mind now consumed by the urgent need to return to his threatened kingdom, was in Acre, personally supervising the loading of his ships for the long voyage home. The Crusader host was scattered, demoralized, and packing up. Saladin, ever the astute general, saw this moment of disarray as his golden opportunity. He had been humiliated at Arsuf, but his army was still a formidable force. He decided to launch a sudden lightning-fast strike to retake the city of Jaffa, the strategic port Richard had won and the linchpin of the Crusader presence in the south. He descended upon the city with a massive army, and its small Christian garrison was caught completely by surprise. The defenders fought bravely, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Saladin's forces smashed through the walls and poured into the city. The Christian soldiers were driven back in a desperate last-ditch defense into the city's small, fortified citadel. They were surrounded, and their surrender was only a matter of hours away. Just as the citadel was about to fall, a priest, a Greek swimmer, and a Genoese sailor managed to slip out of the harbor and sail north with all possible speed. They found King Richard in Acre, his own ship already being loaded with supplies, on the very verge of his departure for England. They burst into his presence and delivered the catastrophic news. Jaffa had fallen, and its last defenders were about to be slaughtered. Any other leader, with his crusade over and his own kingdom in peril, would have accepted the loss and sailed for home. But Richard's reaction was instinctive and immediate. He was not a king retreating. He was a warrior whose men were in danger. "As God lives," he is said to have roared, "I will be with them and I will help them." All thoughts of England vanished. He grabbed the small force he had at hand, a few hundred crossbowmen and a handful of elite knights, boarded a small squadron of fast Genoese galleys and set sail immediately, rowing south in a desperate race against time. The main army would have to follow by the much slower land route. When Richard's small fleet arrived off the coast of Jaffa, the scene was one of total defeat. Saladin's golden banners flew from the city walls. The beach was swarming with thousands of Saracen soldiers, looting the town and preparing for the final assault on the citadel. A landing seemed suicidal. His captains urged him to turn back. But Richard, seeing a lone priest on the citadel's wall who had spotted his ship, refused. He ordered his galley to be rowed straight towards the shore. What happened next became the defining moment of his legend. In an act of almost unbelievable courage, the King of England, now 40 years old, ordered his ship to be run aground. He was the first man off, leaping into the waist-deep surf, his great Danish battle-axe in one hand, a crossbow in the other. Roaring a battle cry, he charged directly from the sea onto the enemy-held beach, a lone, terrifying figure of royal fury. Inspired by their king, his small band of knights plunged into the water after him. The effect on Saladin's soldiers, who were casually preparing for their final assault, was one of pure shock. The sudden appearance of the legendary Malik Rik, whom they thought was miles away in Acre, charging out of the waves like a sea god, stunned them into inaction. Richard and his knights crashed into them, carving a bloody path across the beach. The defenders in the citadel, seeing the king's personal banner suddenly appear below them, were electrified with hope. They threw open their gates and charged out, attacking the Saracens from the other side. Caught between the king from the sea and the garrison from the citadel, Saladin's troops broke and fled the city in chaos. Against all possible odds, in a matter of minutes, Jaffa was miraculously retaken. A few days later, Saladin, deeply humiliated, launched a massive counterattack with his elite Mamluk cavalry. Richard's force was tiny and exhausted. He had perhaps 50 knights, and only 15 of them still had horses. He arranged his few thousand infantry and crossbowmen in a brilliant defensive circle on the plains outside the city, with the spearmen kneeling, their spear butts dug into the ground, creating a bristling wall of steel. In this final desperate battle, Richard's personal heroism reached its peak. He rode relentlessly along his lines, a whirlwind of action, holding his men together by his sheer presence and will. The Muslim chroniclers who witnessed the battle wrote of him with awe, describing how he rode from one end of their army to the other, taunting and challenging any champion to face him, but none dared. At the end of the day, Saladin's army, unable to break the small, unbreakable Christian line, withdrew. It was an almost impossible victory, the crowning achievement of Richard's legend as the ultimate warrior. This was Richard the Lionheart in his element. A whirlwind of battle, a peerless commander, a warrior whose personal courage could turn the tide of a hopeless fight. The victory at Jaffa was the culmination of a military career that had few equals. As a strategist, his coastal march to Arsuf was a masterpiece of logistics and discipline. As a tactician, his ability to react in the heat of battle was instinctive and brilliant. As an engineer, his vision for Château Gallard was revolutionary. And as a personal combatant, his bravery was legendary, inspiring deep loyalty in his men and a profound sense of awe in his enemies. Yet, the qualities that make a peerless warrior are different from those that define a diligent king. To understand Richard's reign in England, one must look beyond the battlefield. His focus, his passions, and his ambitions lay elsewhere. Over a decade as the crowned King of England, he would spend merely a few months on English soil. His world was French-speaking, and his attention was consumed by the vast continental territories that formed the heart of his inheritance. For Richard, England's primary role was to be the engine that powered his ambitions on the world stage. The kingdom's immense wealth was directed towards two monumental goals that defined his life. The first was funding the Great Crusade, an act of supreme Christian piety in his era. The second was gathering the almost unimaginable sum required for his ransom, securing not just his freedom, but the stability of his entire empire. He entrusted the governance of the realm to capable ministers, confident that its well-established laws and institutions would function in his absence. This approach stemmed from his fundamental identity. Richard did not see himself as King of England in the way we might imagine it today. He was the head of the House of Plantagenet, the ruler of the vast Angevin Empire. His homeland was a sprawling collection of lands: Normandy, Anjou, and his beloved Aquitaine. England, while providing him the prestigious title of king, was one part of a larger whole. His life's work, as he saw it, was the defense of this entire inheritance against his great rival, the King of France. Thus, he leaves behind a dual legacy. From the perspective of a 12th century continental prince, he was a master of the game. He successfully defended his lands, upheld his family's honor, and became the most celebrated warrior in Christendom. For the people of England, however, he remained a distant, legendary figure more than a present ruler. He was a king whose glory was renowned throughout the world, a glory that was paid for with English silver, but rarely witnessed on English shores. It is the life, not the legend, that ultimately commands our attention. The story of Richard the Lionheart is so powerful precisely because it requires no embellishment. The historical record alone gives us a figure larger than life, a prince who rebelled against his father, a king who abandoned his kingdom for a sacred quest, a crusader who won the respect of his greatest enemy, and a warrior who met his end not in a grand battle, but due to a twist of fate. He was a man of profound contradictions, a perfect fusion of his parents' conflicting spirits. From his father, Henry, he inherited a boundless, restless energy and a genius for warfare. From his mother, Eleanor, he absorbed the cultured, poetic soul of Aquitaine. He could be ruthless, as the prisoners at Acre discovered, yet he could also be magnanimous, as he was to the crossbowmen who shot him. He was a deeply pious man who took the cross seriously, yet his ambition was entirely of this world. It is little wonder, then, that such a complex and fiery character would inevitably become a legend. Over time, storytellers would smooth away the sharp, difficult edges of the real man to create the shining, unambiguous hero of folklore. But the truth is more fascinating. Richard was not a simple hero. He was the embodiment of the chivalric age in all its glory and all its brutality. He lived by a code of honor, loyalty, and faith, yet operated in a world of savage politics and constant war. He remains one of history's most compelling figures, not because of the myths that followed, but because of the man he was. His loyalty was not to a nation, but to his dynasty and his own formidable sense of honor. He was a storm of action and ambition, a testament to the violent and passionate era that forged him.